We are back. Senators, Twins, baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And we've almost got a full house. Missing is Chad Rubin. Ronnie was telling us, Ronnie Rabinovitz is here. George Case III is here. We're waiting for guest Gary Sarnoff. Chad is still recovering, and it's going to be at least another week, and we're wishing him well in recovery. Ronnie was saying he's out of the hospital. Am I clear on that?
Yes, he is, Ralph.
Okay.
And, he's feeling better, so...
He's feeling better, slow recovery.
Slow recovery, right.
Hope we get a full recovery and get him back here next week.
Absolutely.
George, you and I were talking off air about days of old, and the name of Shirley Povich came up. And tell me a little bit about him. He inducted your dad years after he stopped being a full-time writer into, was it the Washington Hall of Fame?
Yeah, it was the Washington, D.C. Hall of Stars, and it was in October of 1989. My dad had been nominated, and the letter had come, and then Shirley had heard about it, and Shirley and my dad were very good friends, so Shirley wrote me a note, and he said, would you mind if I personally inducted your father into the D.C. Hall of Stars? And I said, obviously not. I would have no problem with that. Our family would be greatly honored. And so,
what a modest guy to word it in that way. Would you
right.
Would it be okay?
That's the gentleman that Shirley was. I mean, he was a terrific guy. And, my dad and Shirley had developed a very nice friendship over the years, and Shirley wrote some very nice articles. And then after my dad passed away, Shirley took it upon himself to write an obituary about my father that appeared on the front page of the Washington Post. So, that was another, wonderful honor that he bestowed upon my dad, and I expressed that to Shirley when I saw him for the induction. I told him how much I appreciated his efforts, and he was very gracious in his comments about my father, and we included part of his speech in our DVD, Ball Field to Battlefield and Back, from FDR to JFK, which we have about 5 or 6 minutes of the induction ceremony. And that same time, Goose Goslin, his brother Jim, accepted the award for Goose, was inducted along with my dad. And Goose and my father were just so happened to be Washington teammates in 1938. So, that was quite a thrill for me to be able to meet Goose's brother, Jim, and who looked exactly like Goose. And, my dad and Goose were quite friendly as well. So the whole thing with Washington and the D.C. Hall of Stars and Shirley Povich, it was quite a day for my family.
Oh,
well,
sure.
I'm trying to get Shirley's son, Maury, who probably, if in history, more people have known Maury Povich than have known Shirley Povich.
Right.
But for an old baseball fan like me, who worshipped the weekly publication, The Sporting News, it would come out and light us up. All baseball fans. I mean, as a kid, before we had subscriptions to it, it would come out in the candy store, and don't read the magazines. The magazines are for buying. And we'd stand there.
That's all you New York people.
I'm just going to read this for a second. The magazines are for buying, not for reading. So that was my early youth. And who was in there every week? Shirley Povich. And he had a column in there, and he also covered the Washington Senators.
Right.
And
a little bit about Shirley Povich, just so as you're talking about that, Ralph. Shirley wrote a daily column for, I don't know, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years in the Washington Post, beginning, I think, with Walter Johnson, and it was called This Morning. And it was all about, Shirley's memories and talking about baseball and Washington, and he did write that weekly column for Sporting News, but the Washington Post columns were daily. And Shirley was probably one of the finest sports writers ever, who ever wrote for anything publication-wise. And I've been told that many politicians in D.C. during those years that Shirley was writing This Morning, the first article that they would read wouldn't really be about the world news or world situation, but they would read Shirley Povich's column.
Really?
Were the sports on the back page of the Post? Was it like the New York Post and the Daily News, where you started?
They were on the back page, right?
Right. Is that how it was in Washington?
You know what? It was. I'll tell you what the Washington Post was. Now I'm assuming it still is. It's what they call a broadsheet, as opposed to a tabloid. The tabloids are the smaller ones, which is what the Sporting News has become, and the Post and the Daily News. But the tabloids are full pages, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they would have an entire section in the back of the newspaper. I think it was probably the third or fourth section, all devoted to sports.
Uh-huh.
And Shirley Povich led the way.
Right. His column was always on the left-hand side of the front page of the sports section, and it was a picture of Shirley with the title This Morning. And it was all about his, recollections and remembrances dating all the way back to the first time he covered Washington, which was during the Walter Johnson era.
George, I have what I think is an interesting question, given some of the recent shows that I've done. One show I did in regard to what I'm going to talk about was with Nancy Finley, talking about the Kansas City A's back when Charlie Finley, her uncle, took over. And there was a fellow named Mel, M-E-H-L, who was pretty much ran the Kansas City Star and had a partial ownership in the team and had a lot of clout in determining how the baseball community accepted Charlie Finley and his hiring and firing of Trader Lane and all of that. My point being, he and Dick Young, who wrote a column for the Daily News and then the Post, had an inordinate amount of power and juice in New York in terms of determining the way teams went. For instance, Dick Young was pretty much responsible for running Tom Seaver out of town. And
really?
yeah. So the press has always had a lot of clout, I'm learning the older I get. Did Shirley Povich have much say in what happened with the Senators in terms of deals being made, setting the climate with the fans for trades and what have you? Was he powerful?
That's a very
along
interesting
the same
question.
lines, George?
I'm not sure that I can answer that because I really don't know, but I can tell you this. The Washington press was not adversarial at all, as far as I remember. Shirley Povich, Bob Addy, they were always boosting Washington and the players and trying to build attendance by, really making it interesting. And I do not recall any articles ever written with regard to a certain player or a certain situation or a certain, team with regard to baseball in Washington. I always felt that Shirley Povich and Bob Addy and those writers were on the side of the Washington players and the Washington management, trying to build interest in the city for Major League Baseball, which they had for many years, they had some very good teams, which, 24 and 25 and 33 years were great, and 43 and 45 when the team came in second. But they had a lot of those lean years. And those lean years, I don't recall any articles that I ever saw, but I do know that Shirley and Addie were well thought of and well respected and were very close to the players on the ball club.
Okay. This is a question for Ron.
Yes.
Today's press in Minnesota, are they along the same lines as George describes Washington's press, non-adversarial?
Yes,
or
more so than not. Yeah, they're not.
More so
they're
than
not.
not.
Right, more so than not. Right.
Okay. Is there are there any writers in Minnesota that have a bit of a sharp edge to them in terms of expectations and what have you?
Well, the biggest writer is Sid Hartman. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
No.
He's like 95 years old, and he started out peddling papers for the Star and Tribune, and he later on became a columnist. He's been there for many, many, many years. He knows everybody. I mean, he had a 90th birthday party I was at, and Bobby Knight was. I mean, every time I turned around, there was some dignitary there. They'd all come in for Sid Hartman's birthday. He's very famous around here. I don't think he's famous nationally, but he is famous around here. And he writes a column like now he writes probably 3 times a week or 4 times a week. But he's not too, he's kind of laid back. He doesn't really go criticizing and this and that. He's kind of the old school.
Right.
So,
well, what a difference between that and the New York press.
Yes, that's right. That's right. They're rough. Rough and tough.
George, I'm going to ask you a question because another one of my co-hosts on this station is a fellow by the name of Michael Duca, who's an official baseball scorer with MLB, basically doing the Giants and the A's out here. And we've been getting into what goes on in the press room regards to scores. Was your dad ever at odds with official scores and their decisions, and not just your dad, but players and managers? Do you have any
That's
stories
always
about
been a topic of discussion, and I don't recall my dad ever being involved in any kind of an argument or anything with regard to whether it was a hit or an error. But I do know the official scores, they have the last say, and occasionally if they make a call, if a ball they felt that should be caught will be charged an error, and a player is going for a batting title or he's looking for his batting average to be increased, and he thinks it should be a hit, occasionally they will confront one another. But I don't recall that ever happening when my dad was playing. But on the other hand, I'm sure it happens quite a bit, and maybe it happens quite a bit today. I don't follow baseball nearly as much as I used to, but I know there's always been controversy between official scorers and players on a team with regard to certain judgment calls that the official scorer makes.
Did your dad ever have a time where he felt compelled to confront a writer and say, hey, listen, I think I was portrayed poorly, or this, that, and the other thing?
Well, again, Ralph, not that I know about. My dad was very quiet and unassuming, and everybody who knew my dad always spoke very highly of him, and my father, never spoke derogatorily about anybody as far as I knew, but there might have been an instance that I never knew about when I was only a little kid when my dad was playing. So that was not a subject that I really knew anything about when he was playing. Now, I do recall certain arguments that my dad would have when he was coaching. It had nothing to do with sports writers or other players, but it happened to be with umpires. And
tell me about that a little bit, because I want to know. Yeah, I want to know. I want to know what goes on between the lines.
Well, I'll tell you the one story that I knew that my dad told me, and this was in, I think it was 1944. He stole 44 bases. He was thrown out only 6 times. And my dad said to me, he said, you know what, those 6 times I'm still safe. So I think, you know, his opinion of umpires, I mean, he got along with umpires. He was thrown out of a game or two with an argument. But, you know, if you'll recall the famous argument that Yogi Berra had with Jackie Robinson, and Ron
Right.
would know about that, when, you know,
Sure.
Robinson stealing home and Yogi, you know, claiming and would claim to the day that he died that Robinson was out, and the umpire called him safe.
He did.
The great story is Yogi and Mrs. Robinson.
Rachel, yeah.
Will,
It's a great story.
Talking about that, tell that story, Ronnie. Years later, they talked about it.
Yeah.
He was out. He was safe.
Yeah.
He was safe. He was out.
That's what they would say when they saw each other. He'd say, he was out. And Rachel would say, he was safe. That's how they begin their conversation.
That is probably one of the most famous arguments I think I've ever seen, that replayed over and over again in newspaper photos and all that of that.
And there's nothing conclusive in
right.
terms. There are some overhead shots that don't conclude. I mean, it's just that close.
Right.
He was safe, though.
Okay, Ronnie, you're showing your Dodger blue.
Well, I'm showing my black and orange Giants.
Yeah.
I is supposed to go to the runner.
That's right.
When it comes that way. So, yeah, but Yogi's reaction was just so right from the gut.
Oh, it was classic, absolutely.
It was really classic. Yeah. He was jumping around like crazy.
Right.
All right.
Screaming.
Hey, George, I want to ask you the effect of coaching on a major league ball player. Now, I know minor league coaches, player development people have a role, an incredible role, but coaching on a major league level has always been downplayed because it is what it is. Your dad was a major league coach. Did he find it frustrating at times trying to teach already established major leaguers?
Well, I think probably it was, although my dad never really talked about it. But I know that he did really enjoy, you know, coaching in the New York Penn League, which was a short season A in 69 to 72, because he had a lot of young kids that were first year players, and they really were learning the game. And my dad was teaching them the finer points of baseball, and then how to handle themselves as professionals. When it came to major league players, I think coaches and managers, basically, you're not talking to the player about how to do something, but you might be talking to him about something that you've noticed that he could improve upon, whether it be
could correct something,
swing,
right?
hitch in his swing, or with a pitcher, you know, maybe his timing isn't right, or he notices that something isn't quite right. But I think that's where most of the coaching comes in, and then when you're the baseline coaches, I mean, you're visible to the fans. You know, the first base coach is really one who's going to determine whether to take an extra base, and the third base coach is one who's going to determine whether or not the runner should hold up or score if he's coming in from second, or to make sure that the runner, you know, if he's going to tag up at third, he's going to wait until the ball is caught, and that kind of thing. But coaching is overrated, I think, when it comes to try to teach at the major league level. Right. But it certainly is critical at the minor league, the lower class.
Absolutely, that entry league first manager, first coach a player has determines basically how he goes about his business, what he learned. What are the things that your dad passed on to those players? The main thing, guys coming in for the first time, what would your dad pass on?
Well, I think what he was passing on to him was to act like a professional, to understand that you are representing, you know, your family, your team, in the community and to, handle things properly off the field. That was the big thing with my dad. He wanted to make sure that the kids, had the proper nutrition and they weren't, running around at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and staggering in the next morning to try to play a game, and that kind of thing is what he tried to teach. And then when he was teaching the young kids as far as base running, which my father was acknowledged as being, really one of the finest teachers of base running, he would talk to the players about how to take a lead, to learn the movement of the pitcher, to learn the movement of the catcher as far as calling pitch outs, how to run, when to run, and that kind of thing. So that's what my dad tried to do, and he was very successful in doing that, and he really enjoyed working with youngsters, and particularly youngsters there in Oneonta, New York. A lot of those kids were first year out of college. They just graduated.
Who were some of those kids that your dad had in their
Well, he had Doc Medich, who went on to play with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he had quite a few minor leaguers who he had. Some of them, moved up the Yankee organization, and some of them went on to other careers. One particular fellow who was one of my dad's favorite, his name was Eddie Waters, and he played for my father in 69 and 70 in Oneonta. He told me personally, he said, the hardest thing your dad ever had to do was to tell me that I did not have a future as a major league player, but that I had a great future in coaching. And he went on, Eddie went on to become one of the most highly acclaimed high school baseball coaches in the state of Florida. And always, talked about my dad and how my dad gave him the good advice. And if he had been trying to, kick around for a few years trying to make a major league ball club and getting frustrated, instead my dad said, hey, Eddie, it's time for you to cut the cord when it comes to looking out to be a player, but your future is really as a coach.
Wow. Isn't that something? That's great. That's terrific.
He molded a guy's career.
Yes, he did.
He actually
and Eddie is still Eddie's a very good friend of mine on Facebook. I've met him a couple times in person, and he always talks about, learning so much about baseball and life, from my father.
I suggest that you get him as a guest on the show.
That would be great.
Try. I mean, Eddie comes up to Oneonta in every year for the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, because the Hall of Fame is only about 30 miles from Oneonta. So I can certainly, send an email to Eddie and see if he would be interested.
Talk to him on Facebook. Talk to him on Facebook. Send him a personal message.
Right. No, that's what I'm going to do. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
Well, that'd be great.
Beautiful.
That'd be great.
I'd love to hear his recollections and his stories about your dad. That would be
that'd be terrific.
Terrific. And then we can hear about some of the play. See, baseball's a line. It's lineage from the line of your dad teaching him. How many players did he develop as a high school coach?
Right.
And and some of them, I'm sure, went on to coach and to manage.
Well, you know what you say there, and that's interesting, Ralph, because about a couple of weeks ago, I think Eddie had a photograph of some of his high school school players who went on professionally, and one or two of them, I think, have a shot at the major leagues. So that is very interesting, the lineage, and I know that we had talked about this before, but when my dad was learning the finer art of base running, his mentor was Clyde Milan, who was a contemporary of Ty Cobb. So, he had a great teacher in Clyde Milan, and in turn, my dad, taught many young players, the finer points of base running and how to handle yourself professionally.
Right. Terrific. Your dad, Gary was going to join us. Gary Sonoff was going to join us, and we were going to talk about the expansion senators a little.
Right.
Gary did not join us, but we are still going to talk about the expansion senators, and your dad coached for them.
Yes, he did.
Was it under manager Mickey Vernon?
Right. Mickey was the manager, had been named the manager after the 1960 World Series. And Danny Murtaugh had activated Mickey, and Mickey played, I think, 8 or 10 games for the Pirates, but he was not eligible for the World Series. But Mickey, it made Mickey a 4-decade player, beginning his career in '39. So that's the first year that my dad knew Mickey, was 1939, and had been lifelong friends. Well, my father was the baseball coach at Rutgers from 1950 to 1960, and Mickey called him up after he had been named manager and said, "George, I'd love to have you join me, and I'm going to ask Sid Hudson, who's another very close friend, to become my pitching coach, but I'd love to have you join me in Washington with the Expansion Ball Club." And my father told me at the time, he said, "You know what, I would have never left Rutgers if it hadn't been for Mickey calling me." And that was
really
his entry back into Major League Baseball as a coach for the Expansion Senators in 1961.
Mm-hmm. And then did he go from there right to the Minnesota Twins?
Well, he did that, Ralph. Ronnie, what he did, he was there 61 to 63, and then Washington asked him to manage the York White Roses for a year in 67. But before that, in 65 and 66, my dad had been the manager for the Hawaii Islanders in the AAA Pacific Coast League. And then after 65, 66, 67, then in 68 is when he became the Minnesota Twins third base coach. Cal Herman was the manager, and my dad had known one another. But probably the reason my dad went to Minnesota was that he was very good friends with Calvin Griffith, and I think Calvin personally asked my dad to join the ball club.
Mm-hmm. And how many years did he coach there?
He was only there the 1 year. They had a bad year in '68. I know when my dad took the job, he really thought that they had a shot at the World Series because they had a great team, a year or 2 years before that. And in '68, they had all those guys still there, Killebrew and Allison and Carew and Oliva and all those great players.
Right? Yeah.
But they had a terrible year injury-wise. Herman Killebrew tore his hamstring and I think only played 100 games out of the 162-game schedule. So, 68 turned out to be a disaster as far as the team because of the injury. The players were terrific. And then the next year, Billy Martin took over, and Billy led them to the American League East or West Division Championship.
Mm-hmm. And your dad coached under Billy Martin?
Yeah, my dad and Billy Martin. My father had left in '68. That's when he went to Oneonta in '69. But Billy was on the staff. It was the coaching staff was my dad as the third base coach, and then Billy Martin as the first base coach, Bob Oldus as the bullpen coach, and Early Wynn as the pitching coach.
Wow. Bob Oldus was a coach with the Pirates for many years, I remember.
I think he was, and he was also a Washington player. So there was some connection there between the old Senators and the Twins, going back. That Oldus.
How did Early Wynn come into it?
Early Wynn had been a very good friend of my dad, and the fact that Early had such a great career with the Indians and the White Sox, won 300 games, and my dad and Early were very good friends. Matter of fact, we were next door neighbors during baseball season in Washington with Early Wynn and his family. I grew up with Early's son, Joe Early, and my dad and Early used to, go to the ballpark. They'd drive together out of College Park, Maryland, so that was for a year or two. And, it just so happened that I guess Calvin had talked to my dad and also talked to Early Wynn and wanted Early to join the staff of the Twins, and Early was happy to do it. So my father and Early, were able to get back together again in '68 and renew their friendship.
Nice.
That's great. That's
no
terrific.
pressure as a coach, am I right? Compared to managing when your dad managed in the minors, it was a much easier life as coach.
Absolutely, no question. The manager at the major league level, he's the one that has to make all the decisions, and he's the one that the fans and the writers are going to get after if a good decision turns out to be the wrong one. But on the other hand, if you're managing at the minor league level, it's a lot less pressure because you're really in more of a teaching situation. Where in the major league level, you're at that decision-making situation, right?
Sure. Now, the Minnesota Twins today are doing pretty good.
Talk about them. They are Had a good week this week. They won last night, and boy,
I think Ronnie, they're what? Are they in second place or third place?
They're in second place.
Second place.
Yep. Second
but
place.
Right now, they're
real
in
contention
the wild card,
for the wild card, the second wild card.
And, they are in the contention right now for the wild card. Yeah.
Right.
The last 10 games, they were 7-3. So that's not bad.
And we're coming down to the end of, pretty soon. It's September, and you really have a pennant race, and what a surprise! Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
I can't tell Ronnie
Rabinovitz, whose Dodgers are just amazing, and you care for the Twins. What happens when the Dodgers play the Twins? Do you just sleep through it?
I'm a Dodger fan.
All right.
Fortunately, they're not in the same league, so
Yeah, Ronnie shows you true colors when the Dodgers and Twins meet.
It happens occasionally.
Occasionally.
In a league.
Yep. Occasionally.
Loyalties are tested at times in baseball, especially this time of year when some teams are in it and some teams are not in it. Your team may not be in it. The secondary team may be in it, and they play each other. It is complicated, and what makes it more complicated is fantasy baseball. I don't know if you guys play Roto League fantasy ball.
I don't.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, I know a lot of my friends do, but I don't. I would rather either talk about baseball history or watch a ball game and understand what's going on. I really don't get involved in fantasy baseball or fantasy football. A lot of people do.
Well, when you're talking about baseball history, George Case III is your man.
That's right.
Tell the audience about your CD, your very fine CD, where they can get it, how it was made, and remember, podcasting, it's selfless self-promotion. And
well, I'm not going to be a self-promoter, but I do think.
Oh, yes, you are this time. I'm encouraging you to be.
I think what we've done, we've come up with really a unique item. It is a CD, a DVD of Major League Baseball in full color with a narration by my father and Mickey Vernon, and it's called Ball Field to Battlefield and Back, from FDR to JFK, and it's about 60 minutes in length. And the DVD is available from me on my website, which is timelessbaseball at Verizon.net. And we've sold probably at least, I think, 1,000, maybe more, to people who really remember Major League Baseball during the war years. But the fact that it was in color, and it was really not game footage. What it is, it's behind the scenes. It's what ball players do every day that the fans don't see. It's spring training, and it was train rides back in the early days of World War II, and the old ballparks, most of them which are no longer in existence, Griffith Stadium and Sportsman's Park and Briggs Stadium and Comiskey Park and Yankee Stadium in its original form, the house that Ruth built, not the renovated or the new Yankee Stadium. But it's really a look at baseball back then, and the fact that my dad and Mickey had the foresight, which we included in the DVD. It's about 60 minutes long of the narration of the scenes that are on the DVD. And about 7 minutes of that original film was used by HBO for their series called When It Was a Game. And if many of the people listening to our podcast are familiar with When It Was a Game, it was very highly thought of, and the fact that it was produced by HBO, but about 7 minutes of that footage came from our DVD.
Right.
That's great.
What was the most satisfying part of putting that together?
Well, for me, Ralph, it was doing a lot of editing, and myself and a gentleman named Jim Van Koski, who was very close to Mickey, we spent months going through the footage with, technical and putting things in, taking things out, making sure that we identified all the players as to the branch of service that they were in during World War II. And it was just a trip down memory lane for me. And I remember that my dad would, when he was playing, and I was just a youngster, and he would come home from, the season, and he'd have his 8mm film, and he'd put it in the projector and throw it up on the screen in our living room. And I can remember distinctly saying to my father, I said, Daddy, do we have to see these again? I had no idea the significance of it. It was silent. And I used to say to my father later on, I said, Dad, we have to really be able to preserve this. So what he did on his own, he took the film, had it made into a CD, which was silent, put a tape recorder on, and just recorded his memories of what the scenes were. And then after my father passed away, I was able to combine the audio with the video and produce the DVD. And so for me, it was a labor of love, and I really enjoyed doing it.
It had to be awfully difficult for you on many different levels, George.
Yes.
Just hearing your dad's voice.
Yes.
You had to take a big, deep sigh. It might have been fun overall, but wow, huh?
Well, you know what, Ralph and Ronnie, when you mentioned that, it was hard. But on the other hand, the last couple of years of my dad's life were very difficult because he had emphysema and he struggled to breathe, and he and I were very close. But for me to see what he did, 40, 50 years ago, and how, he was able to use the camera, which was his hobby. He loved to take motion pictures. And, he took them of his family. I have pictures of myself running around as a little kid, and that was really interesting for me. But, when I heard my dad's voice, it was his voice as an older person and one who was struggling. But his younger days, when I remember my dad, he was a very strong, vital person who, loved baseball, and people loved him, and he was very close. My mother and father were very close, and our family, and that was always very important to him. So the DVD itself was my way of honoring my dad's memory.
That's great.
I gotta ask you,
fabulous.
I read a book, and it was, when I was a kid, it was called The Rebellion of Yale Merit, and it was by a guy named Robert Rimmer. Now, the book and the title the author have nothing to do with this question. This question is, what was the rebellion of George Case III in your life?
I must tell you that there was no rebellion. I loved my father. I loved baseball. I was able to play. And maybe if I wasn't able to play and people would criticize me about not being able to play, maybe I would have rebelled and did something else. But for me, from the very earliest time I remember, and I recall then being in high school and people would ask me, well, what do you want to do? And I'd say, I want to play baseball. That's what I did. And that's what I loved. And I had no rebellion that I recall. I mean, if you're a teenager.
And you could have, from those words of that little league mother or father.
I was able to handle that, Ralph. That was that one that I'd mentioned when the guy said, you'll never be as good as your old man. But, I was only 11 years old at the time. But, I had heard.
But you could have chosen anger. You really could have. You could have chosen, wow. And if your dad was perhaps someone else, things could have been different. Man, he had some class.
Well, he was very low key, and he would always tell me, and I've mentioned this before. He used to say to me, he said, "Look, if you never pick up a baseball or a bat in your life, it won't matter to me. I love you. You're my son," and that's what he taught me, and that's what I've taught my children and grandchildren. That the same kind of an attitude, and that's why I think it probably wasn't a rebellion, because I really admired my dad as a person, because he was so well thought of by everybody, and everybody who ever met him they'd say what a wonderful gentleman he was, and that's what I tried to model my life after his.
Nice.
Well, you sure have. You sure have.
Yes, you have.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, you have.
And
and my dad and I have a similar relationship as your dad, George, and it seems like it really, it's so important to have a father figure like that that's so close to you, as my dad was close to me, and I mean what he taught me and things like that.
Well, right, Ronnie, and you know exactly what I'm talking about because you know your experience was almost identical, and with you and your father in the political world, and then you know baseball with Jackie, but with me, it was the baseball world from the first my first remembrance as a youngster.
Yeah.
You know, going to ballparks, knowing players, and really growing up in the game.
Right, absolutely. It meant a lot for me too.
So I'm going to ask you guys.
Yeah.
Before we close, I'm going to ask: is baseball a microcosm of life, or is life a microcosm of baseball?
Good question.
That's an interesting question because I think about that. I think about that often.
All right, that's just more rhetorical than anything else. But let's think about that all week, and we'll come back next week and we'll examine it.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Going back to the Twins for 1 second. Last year at this time, they were 49-72. This year they're 62-59. So no matter what they do, it's a heck of an improvement.
That's a heck of a turnaround. Yeah. That's right, Ron.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's right. And I have an interesting thing that's happening tonight. There's a semi-pro league called St. Paul Saints. It used to be the minor league affiliate for the Dodgers.
St. Paul,
Minneapolis.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they're having a special tonight where they're honoring Roy Campanella because he played for the St. Paul Saints as a Dodger, in their Dodger affiliation. So it's going to be a fun evening, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Indeed. And I'll tell you what a big role the Dodger affiliation of St. Paul had in the Giants and Dodgers moving out to California.
That's right. Because
there
Minneapolis
was a time when the Giants were on their way to Minnesota and Minneapolis. And O'Malley knew that to take the Dodgers to California wouldn't work without the Giants being out there, so a team could come out and have a road trip that constituted more than just come to California and just go back all those miles.
Right.
So what he did was he basically held it over Stoneham in some way. I don't think he ever had to act on it, but he let Stoneham know that he had territorial rights to the area. And Stoneham was not as savvy. He was just into going along to get along more so diabolical O'Malley. And there are other adjectives I could throw in there. But let's start with diabolical. And to some people that doesn't sound, well, diabolical, that's not a very nice thing to say. You've got a lot of things to say. That's just one of them. So
it's no question, Ralph, and what you and Ronnie are talking about, that rivalry between the Giants and the Dodgers, which started in New York, made its way to the West Coast. But one other player, a key player in that whole thing, and Ronnie, I'm sure you've heard about it, was Willie Mays. And Willie Mays played in Minneapolis.
He played Minneapolis for
New
the
York
Millers.
City.
That's right. That's right.
He started in Birmingham in 1950, and then went to Trenton, and then went to Minneapolis.
Minneapolis was their AAA farm club.
Right.
And St. Paul Saints were the Dodgers. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. What happened to the Giants this year, Ralph?
Well, they died.
You'd rather not talk about it.
I know. But I mean,
they passed away. But there was a whole bunch of different stuff. But I'll tell you
that he'll be back.
Number one thing was the failure of Mellencamp in relief. They gave him like $60 zillion. That hurt him. They put a lot of. Bumgarner had an accident an off the field accident where he crashed a motorcycle. Different than others who have done similar things, people like Jeff Kent, for instance.
Right.
He copped to it right away. He said he made a mistake. He did this, that, and the other thing, but he didn't lie about it. And as we all know, lying and covering it up never really works. That's weird.
No. That's right.
So they kind of lost the season. That and a number of other things. Crawford had a very bad year.
And I think they're basically a very good organization. It's just
they're an excellent organization. They'll be back soon, and but as a Dodger fan, it's your turn to quell, Ronnie Rabinovitz.
Yeah, I am.
Step right up. They haven't won for a long time, and
1988. It's a long time.
In a way,
they're running away with it right now. I'll tell you that.
Wow, unbelievable! I just hope they can run away with it in October.
Right.
That's what.
And when you think back to '88, when you think that dramatic Gibson shot off Eckersley, wow, is baseball not great? Just
it's great.
Every thought evokes another thought, and we can go on like this all day and all night. Marianne.
Some people say that baseball is boring. I don't see it as boring. I think it's the most exciting sport. It's just so wonderful.
I agree with you, Ronnie. I agree with you. And people have said that to me.
It's only boring to those with dull minds.
Well, it's that, and I think if you watch baseball on television, it can be boring because you don't see all that goes on. If you go to a ballpark and you understand the game and how the players are moving and the various pitches and the various situations, I mean, it's a thinking man's game. And if you're just somebody who's watching it on television and you're seeing the pitcher staring down the hitter and the hitter pulling with his gloves and people in the dugout spitting sunflower seeds, that's not baseball. That's what television is showing.
That's right.
Right.
There's so much intricacy to it. And do you think that there's more strategy in the National League than the American League because they have pitchers that, you know what I mean?
I do. I do. Absolutely.
I do too.
I think there's a tremendous difference when you're talking about a DH in the American League and no DH in the National League. The situation occurs, the pitcher comes up, the pitcher has to be able to either move the runners or put a bunt down or do something to help his cause.
Right.
The American League, you just have a guy who's a great hitter who's sitting on the bench, and the situation comes in, the guy is in the batting order, and he goes out and hits.
Yeah.
I think it's a totally different strategy.
But sadly, that's so much easier to sell to the masses that are only interested in the home run or the strikeout, that one big moment.
Oh, I agree.
All the take two and hit to right and get the guy over and this, that, and the other thing. It's all going for naught. But
it is.
Secular.
And I happen to agree with you, Ralph. If you understand baseball and you look and you say, okay, the guy's on first base, what is the job now of the next hitter? The job is to advance that runner. It's not to hit a home run. It's to get that runner in scoring position. The fact is that, the same thing with a pitcher. I mean, if a pitcher is going to bear down and now they're doing the doggone pitch counts, which I don't agree with either, but they're doing it. So a pitcher is out there for 6
I don't agree with it either.
But how easy is it to motivate a player to do that when he goes to negotiate his contract? They don't care if he hit a ground ball to second and got the guy over and he later scored. That doesn't come into it. Right. All that comes into it is his average, his batting average, his OPS, it's this, that, and the other thing, his WAR, his blah, blah, blah. All those stats go lost. They come under the category of intangibles. And intangibles win World Series, but as Ralph kind of said, home run hitters drive Cadillacs. So,
exactly.
Well, when they're doing their multi-million-dollar contracts, it certainly does. When my dad was playing, and I've said this before, the players themselves, they were paid 1-year contracts. They would negotiate the contract with either the owner or the general manager, and it was based upon their performance the year before. And the fact is that there is an oft-told story. Ted Williams 1 year was offered, I think, $100,000 by Tom Yawkey, had a bad year, went to Yawkey and said, Mr. Yawkey, I'm not worth $100,000 after what I did last year, and they settled for $80,000. Now, can you imagine players doing that today?
Can you imagine that? Yeah, today.
Yeah.
No way.
You want to pay me $100 million today or $200 million tomorrow?
Right. That's right.
Hey, something out of the news, guys, that thinking of changing Tom Yawkey Lane to something else, taking his name off of it. He's a Southern cracker who held back Jackie, held back Willie, held back integration till 1959 when Pumpsy Green came up, 1959. Almost as bad as the Yankees, who didn't integrate until 1956.
Right.
But they're no longer, this country's taken a change. They're no longer going to pay homage. They're still in our history, but folks that, Robert E. Lee, they're taking down statues of people and stopping to commemorate folks who were just blatant racists. And
right.
Trump says, well, where are you going to stop? Are you going to stop with Jefferson and Washington?
Yeah.
Guess what? They were slave owners. But that's just a little aside. We're in Washington, right? We're talking about Washington.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. And
Washington, traditionally, as you know, I mean, Washington did not have black players until I think it was Carlos Paula or one of those players that came along. But Washington had numerous black Cubans. And
absolutely,
because,
that's Camilo Pascual's.
Right, they were dark skinned. They were dark skinned Cubans and
Davalios.
Yeah.
Do you remember that name, George?
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
There
were a lot of those players, Ralph, and the fact that Joe Cambria, who also signed my dad, had been the Cuban connection. They called the Cuban players called him Papa Joe, and he did for Clark Griffith. He was able to mine the area of Cuba, before the embargo. And the fact is, a lot of those Cuban players were dark skinned. They would come to Washington,
George,
and Washington had been
a
white city.
There were rumors. I understand it to be that Fidel Castro was actually scouted by Cambria.
Yes,
for the Washington.
He was, Ralph. And my understanding was that he was scouted, but that Cambria went back to Clark Griffith and said, he just doesn't have what it takes to be a major league ball player. He was very good, from what I understand, but he was never signed. And I do believe that Cambria did go and scout him at one point, but that's as far as it went.
Wow.
Clark Griffith took an active part in scouting and player development and deals and whatnot.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, yes, he did, very much so. He played the game because he had to. The baseball was his sole source of income. So he was very much involved.
About next week, we make the topic of the show Cambria himself. And we'll get some interesting stories. You guys can
I can tell you a few stories about Joe Cambria too.
Beautiful.
Okay.
That's the hook for next week, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay.
And plus, we're going to have Chad Rubin back. We'll talk more Twins.
Right.
This is cool. I enjoy spending my Sundays with you guys. Sundays, it's almost like Bud Collins. Sundays at Wimbledon, Sundays in Washington.
Sundays with Ralph and George.
Thank you.
But Sundays with George and Ronnie.
Great.
Let's put it.
Always enjoyable for me, guys. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Take care.
See you next week, everybody.
Week.
Keep on.
Okay.
Keeping on.
Talk to you later.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye now. Bye now.